You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
During President's Day savings at the Home Depot, get up to 35% off select appliances. Plus, save up to an extra $450 on select appliances like Whirlpool. Shop the side-by-side fingerprint-resistant stainless steel refrigerator with an indoor can caddy. Or the fingerprint-resistant stainless steel top control dishwasher with 3 5-inch shelves. Make the most of President's Day savings and our lowest prices guaranteed at the Home Depot. How doers get more done. See homedepot.com/price match for details. See store or online for details. Minimum purchase required.
More rewards, more savings. With American Express Business Gold, earn up to $395 back in annual statement credits on eligible purchases at select shipping, food delivery, and retail subscription merchants, including the $155 Walmart Plus monthly membership credit and $240 flexible business credit. Enjoy the benefits of membership with the Amex Business Gold Card. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold Card, built for business by American Express.
Hello everyone and welcome to another set of older member episodes that are being released here on the main episode feed. This series of episodes covers the interwar Royal Navy, which seemed appropriate as the podcast is about to start its episodes on the Battle of Britain. In fact, that's what I'm working on right now, which is why you're hearing this. There will be 6 episodes in total released over the next 6 weeks as I get this next series on the Battle of Britain kind of sorted out, prepared, and ready for release. Thank you for your patience, and here's the episode. Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, Members Episode 16. We're going to close out our series of episodes on the Royal Navy with a discussion of how the Royal Navy trained for the war, the final preparations for September 1939, and then what happened immediately after the start of hostilities. Over the last 5 episodes, we have discussed in some detail the ships that the Royal Navy was building and where they planned to use them around the world. But in this episode, we will get a bit more detailed about how they were preparing to fight a war, and then the frantic nature of the preparations as war appeared to be just months, weeks, and then days away. It was in those months and then the early months of the war when all of the British preparation and planning would be put to the test, and in some cases they would prove to have been correct moves, like the massive effort put into the creation of small trade escort vessels, while other decisions would prove to be a bit less fortuitous. The events and actions of the Royal Navy will obviously play a huge role in our story of the war, especially in the first several years of the conflict, when the German threat was at its peak and Japan and America had not yet entered the conflict. In those events, the Royal Navy was forced to act within the constraints it had placed upon itself in the years before the war. A lot of the constraints that we've discussed already and then we will discuss in this episode. When it came to the overall planning and structure of the Royal Navy on the eve of the war, the evolution would begin after the First World War, at a time when it would go through a bit of chaos as the conflict ended, and then again after the Washington Naval Conference when chaos again reigned for a short period. Massive budget cuts for the Royal Navy resulted in large numbers of ships being decommissioned, which was matched by every other navy in the world. Along with this, the Royal Navy had the benefit of the fact that the German fleet, which had driven so much expansion before 1914, no longer existed. Other continental rivals were also not in a position to challenge the Royal Navy, with France in a horrible economic state and Russia in the midst of revolution and civil war. Even with these facts, the organization of the fleet was similar to what it had been during the war, with the main fleet focused in home waters and what were termed detached forces in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and then also local defense forces at various points around the world, which were just very small detachments. As we have discussed several times over these episodes, the rising power of Italy and Japan during the 1930s would cause this structure to be reevaluated over the course of the interwar period. For example, there were proposals during the late 1920s to move more strength out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic fleet. Many of these moves during the interwar period were suggested and sometimes carried out due to the specific assumed threats around the world and how the Royal Navy planned to address them. The plans that were made included plans for wars against essentially everyone, including France and Italy, even when they were very friendly with Britain. There were also some plans for a war with the United States, but under the definitive statement that it would be an incredibly bad idea. The Royal Navy in such a situation would be forced into a defensive stance, and that posed incredible challenges when it came to defending the empire. Instead of preparing for such a war in a serious way, the Royal Navy went the other direction and fostered closer relations with the United States Navy. Technical information was shared, and the Americans were given access to Gibraltar and Malta as port facilities. Then in the 1930s, the German Navy began to grow, and this almost demanded that more resources be moved out of the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean had been seen as the primary European naval theater during the early 1930s, and into the mid-1930s as well, due to the increase in tensions with Italy. But the shift to seeing Germany as the greater threat meant that more resources had to be brought out into the Atlantic to protect shipping. While there were some good guesses around what the next war would look like, all the moves that I just discussed were pretty good estimations of what was happening, there were also mistakes that were made. Here is Joseph Moretz from the Royal Navy and the capital ship in the interwar period and operational perspective. Quote, at the tactical level, the Royal Navy made two key assumptions about the future of naval warfare that would prove to be false. First, it assumed that the next naval war would be fought in a chemical environment, and one of the first measures taken at the time of the Abyssinian crisis was to ship decontamination stores from Britain to Malta for use by the Mediterranean fleet. The second key assumption was that notwithstanding the importance of the aircraft carrier to fleet operations, a fleet action would continue in the event of their loss or damage. The assumption implied that a foreign naval power would continue to seek battle rather than disengage if such an aircraft loss occurred, and unconsciously confirmed that the final arbiter in a surface action remained the capital ship. End quote. During the war, both of these assumptions would prove to be incorrect, as there would be no meaningful chemical threat to any naval vessels, and generally the first thing that ships would do when they lost air cover, either from aircraft carriers or shore-based aircraft, was to run away as quickly as possible. There was a recognition that large ships would be very threatened by air power, and this problem would be evaluated as well as it could be in several interwar exercises. A report published in January 1939 emphasized this threat, containing the claim that the Admiralty should expect 2 hits on every capital ship for each bomber shot down by anti-aircraft fire. This caused a frantic order for large numbers of new anti-aircraft guns, but it would have proved to be too late to make too much of a change to total anti-aircraft capabilities of the fleet. While there were concerns that, aircraft could cause casualties among the fleet, there was still the belief that it would be the fleet, it would be the battleships, the capital ships, that would still be the decisive feature of naval warfare. And again, as I sometimes like to point out, while we know that this today it was quite wrong, this was in line with essentially every other naval power's views in 1939. While ships were being moved around the board, training became a major concern. At a tactical level, the maneuvering orders and the battle instructions were the two doctrinal statements that really sought to control what the Royal Navy was doing, with the maneuvering orders discussing fleet positioning while the battle instructions laid out what ships should do during a confrontation. Just like so many other areas, these would also evolve over the interwar period. Part of this was due to the experiences of the First World War, and also due to the fleets that the Royal Navy expected to fight in the next war. Coming into the First World War, the Grand Fleet had been prepared to fight in the classic line-ahead setup, with ships following one another to bring as much broadside as possible on the enemy. Everything that the fleet did was built around that moment. For example, cruising formations were constructed to allow the ships to come into line as quickly and efficiently as possible. This was altered during the interwar period for 2 reasons. The first was the power of torpedoes, with the movements needed to avoid torpedoes playing havoc with the line-ahead formation, and the line making a great target for torpedoes as well, as seen at places like Jutland. The second reason was due to how the British expected their enemies to fight. This was most important during the 1930s as the Germans rebuilt their fleet, and the Royal Navy assumed that they would not opt into a Jutland-style battle during the next conflict. The line ahead, due to its structure, was not good for quick changes of direction and speed, and really worked best when the enemy was doing the same thing. Instead, the British believed that they would need to fight in a far more dispersed manner, probably with several battle groups at a time that would move and react to the enemy as things developed. The British would have preferred a more concentrated action. They had the most ships overall, but they did recognize that it was unlikely to happen. The outcome of this was that the Royal Navy of 1939 was fully prepared to fight in highly maneuverable divisions. This provided much greater flexibility in the face of enemy actions that would probably mirror such a setup. While this was not the preferred sort of way that the Royal Navy wanted to fight, as the war experiences would show, optimizing for these small battle groups was absolutely the correct course of action for the Royal Navy. This would be the most apparent in the convoy protection duties that they were forced into in the early years of the war. While this change and many others that the Royal Navy would make were sound, like they were good and based on good reasons, personnel was a problem. Because in the years after the First World War and the constant reductions in personnel that followed, there was a constant churn of naval personnel. There was simply not enough of them, and most ships were never manned by more than a fraction of their full crews, which made lengthy long-term exercises almost impossible. This shortage of men was bad enough during the 1920s and 30s, but then by the time that the Royal Navy started to expand in the late 1930s, it very quickly found itself far short of junior officers. There was a smaller pool of experienced men and officers to pull from for these positions, and this would only become more problematic during the war years. During that time, due to losses at sea and then further naval expansion, the total talent of the Royal Navy was greatly diluted. This problem was recognized by the First Lord of the Admiralty, Alexander, and during his stint as First Lord, he would make some changes. Alexander was a Labour Party member, and the reforms that he made fell in line with those political beliefs. He made it easier for working-class individuals to become naval officers, instead of the traditional middle and upper classes, which could afford the tuition at Dartmouth College. The Sea Lords were not necessarily in favor of this, but Alexander continued to push for it, and the recruiting pool would be expanded. There were also efforts to make it easier for non-officers in the Navy to make the jump to a commission, which was very favorably viewed by those men who now had new opportunities for what I think are pretty obvious reasons. Attempts were also made at this time to make wide-ranging reforms of the Naval Disciplinary Code, but this proved to be a reform too far that would not be completed before the fall of the Labour government and the removal of Alexander in 1931. Training the men was also another problem, in all aspects of naval warfare. For example, in the area of gunnery practice, budget constraints would be just as much of a problem as in other areas. After the First World War was over, there was no shortage of surplus naval munitions that could be used during shooting practice, but then as that ammunition was used, it was not replaced. This caused a mandatory curtailment of gunnery practice, especially for the largest guns in the fleet. This was seen as a major problem, in no small part due to the expected engagement ranges that the Royal Navy believed future naval battles would be fought at. There were several different pieces of technology that tried to assist gunners in actually hitting things. On board of naval vessels, there were two different plots. One was a 5 mile to an inch, which was used to track fleet movement. And then there was the tactical plot, which was 1 to 2 miles per inch, which was used to assist in gunnery. There were also some advancements in fire control that allowed all the guns of the ship to be fired using a single director. This synchronized aiming replaced the turret-based aiming of earlier years, and this allowed for much greater control, especially when trying to lay all the guns of an entire fleet on a single target. But these methods of controlling fire were only as good as the sailors that were using them, and as gunnery practice decreased, so did expected hit rates. This led the Royal Navy to begin serious discussions about emphasizing night fighting and other methods of drastically reducing engagement ranges. This was seen as a way to neutralize any range and accuracy advantages enjoyed by other navies. The likely furthest range that a fleet could be engaged was over 27,000 yards, with the Japanese and Americans planning for similar ranges. But at that distance, hits were seen as a rarity, and they would be a rarity, and the hope was that the distance could be reduced as much as possible. All of these possible shifts in operating procedure were tested in various fleet exercises, which grew both in frequency and intensity during the last years before the war. This included RAF participation, which also often involved testing aerial reconnaissance and coordination between naval and aviation assets. Remember that for most of the 1930s, the RAF was still in control of all aviation assets aboard ship. It was during this time that a lot of consideration was given to other tasks that would also be required of the Royal Navy. For example, in the Naval War Manual that was written in 1938, trade defense was a major topic that was covered at great length. This would presage the focus that the Royal Navy and the government would put on the mass creation of trade defense ships after the war started.
is Born Again on Disney Plus. Why did you stop being a vigilante? The line was crossed. Sometimes peace needs to be broken. And chaos must reign. On March 4th, the 9-episode event begins. I was raised to believe in grace, but I was also raised to believe in retribution. Marvel Television's Daredevil, Born Again. Don't miss the 2-episode premiere March 4th, only on Disney Plus.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
While in some areas real changes were being made and real realizations were occurring that would shift how the Royal Navy planned to fight a war, one unresolved problem that would continue to sort of bedevil Admiralty's plans was around the Far East. To recap, the Royal Navy's official plan for a war with Japan was that the base at Singapore had to hold out against any Japanese attacks while a fleet was concentrated in Europe that would be sent to the Far East. However, there would be yet another report that would question whether or not this plan was possible, or in any way even feasible. This was created by a conference in Singapore in June 1939. The general conclusion of this report was that Singapore was not nearly strong enough to stand up to a large siege, especially if the Japanese were to capture land around the city and launch a land assault. Because of this, the only way that a long defense could be mounted was by holding more territory on the Malay Peninsula, which would require more resources. Of particular importance were the airfields that were northeast of the city. More resources could not be sent, though. They were needed in Europe. These shortcomings were made even more problematic when the Royal Navy extended the period in which Singapore would be without fleet support, which was increased from 70 to 90 days. This was honestly a far more accurate assessment of the situation, and the 70-day figure had always been pretty optimistic. However, as war seemed to be coming closer and closer in Europe, the plans for doing anything in a war with Japan became more and more problematic. In what was quite the understatement, one Admiralty memo would say, quote, "There can be no doubt that the intervention of Japan would be a serious threat to our position in the Far East." One of the major problems was that Italy seemed firmly in the German camp by the summer of 1939, which meant that the Royal Navy had to be very concerned not just about defending the Mediterranean, but could also not depend on moving a fleet through the Mediterranean and towards Singapore. The growing power of Germany was also, of course, a concern, and the defense of home waters would always fall higher in priority than the Far East, with the estimates in August 1939 putting the requirement of having 6 capital ships in home waters at all times to deal with the 2 German Scharnhorst-class battleships and then the Deutschland-class pocket battleships, and this was even before the Bismarck really entered the picture. With these requirements, the maximum that could be sent to face the Japanese were 7 capital ships and 1 aircraft carrier, and even in that case, it would include ships that were far less than the ideal, like the unmodernized Queen Elizabeths. And then even these numbers were based on the optimistic assessment that at the very least the Italians would stay neutral, and the French would be able to massively counterbalance the Italian threat in the Mediterranean. As late as November 1939, so after the war started in Europe, Australia and New Zealand were asking the Admiralty to reaffirm their stance on Singapore, and promises were given that it would be given priority over the Mediterranean. However, this was given before the disaster that was the summer of 1940 and the fall of France, and any assistance of the French Navy was suddenly no longer possible, which made any dispatch of sizable Royal Navy forces simply impossible. The 1939 construction program would also be heavily disrupted by the war, but when it was outlined in early 1939, after the massive construction of the previous years, it represented something of a reduction in the overall expansion of the Navy. But even with some of this restriction, the plan was still massive by pre-rearmament standards, with 2 battleships and a carrier being laid down, along with many smaller ships. It doesn't really make sense to go too much deeper into this plan because it would be drastically changed over the months after its implementation, with the battleships cut in favor of larger numbers of smaller ships that could be used in trade defense. Part of these changes were also to simply kind of boost short-term benefits or bring on more ships as quickly as possible, with longer-term projects like the 16-inch Lion battleships seen as a worthy investment and something that the Royal Navy really wanted, but ones that would simply take too long to pay off. There'd already been a heavier emphasis on smaller ships after the Munich crisis when the war seemed imminent, and this would continue. This is also where the Vanguard came into play that we discussed a few episodes ago, simply as a way to get a capital ship out as soon as possible. All of these changes became more urgent when Hitler officially denounced the 1935 agreement, which had put limits on German construction. This was not an unexpected move, but it was just yet another reason that immediate naval power was so important. Then the war started. Before September 1939, there had been some situations where the fleet had prepared for war. For example, during the Munich crisis, the Mediterranean fleet had fully prepared for war, with warloads of ammunition being placed on ships and it preparing to sail. Then a week before the war itself, so this is, late August 1939, an immediate telegram was sent by the Defense Preparedness Committee. This was different than a warning telegram that would have meant that the war was imminent. Instead, the immediate telegram just informed the appropriate officers that the situation was critical. Another notification was given to all merchant ships to not put into German or Italian ports out of concern that they would be stuck there for the duration. The program to transition some merchant ships to armed merchant cruisers also began, while some trawlers began to be kitted out for anti-submarine duties. At the start of the war, the total combat-ready strength of the Royal Navy was 12 battleships and battlecruisers, 6 aircraft carriers, 58 cruisers, and 100 destroyers. However, there were a huge number of ships under construction, almost 150 of them, which had been started in the previous 3 years. Of course, not all of those would be completed, but during the early months of the war, many of the smaller ships would come online. The vast majority of the strength was concentrated in home waters and the Mediterranean. In mid-July, a step had also been taken to activate the reserve fleet and to bring on several groups of reservists to bring those ships far closer to a ready state. In the Mediterranean, the fleet was also prepared to move from Malta to Alexandria. The general feeling was that Malta was simply too exposed, being so close to Italy. The port facilities in Alexandria were less impressive, but this was felt to be a reasonable trade-off for additional security. On September 1st, that warning telegram would finally be delivered, with both Germany and Italy named as potential enemies. This was not the declaration of war notification, but it put the Navy on a war footing. Mobilization was called for, including the full activation of naval reserves. Then the signal to the fleet that hostilities had commenced was delivered at 11:15 a.m. on September 3rd. In the Mediterranean, the fleet made its official move to Alexandria. In home waters, the home fleet started mobilization as well. The primary base of the fleet was based in Scapa Flow for some of the same reasons that it had been during the First World War. It was ideally positioned to maintain a distant blockade of the North Sea. There were also new reasons as well, primarily that it was out of range of possible German air attack, something that was not true of bases further south. One of the primary problems for the home fleet, at least when it came to the larger ships of the fleet, was age. Several of the ships had not been modernized when the war started, including ships like the Hood, which was scheduled to go into port for its modernization the same month that the war started. Scapa Flow was also not the impenetrable fortress that the Royal Navy would have liked. Its defenses would prove to not be ready for a proactive set of German submarine attacks. Over the course of the first months of the war, a lot of things would then proceed to not go at all the way the Royal Navy had hoped. A lot of faith had been placed in the blockade to have much the same effect that it had during the First World War. But the economic situation in the Second World War was completely different, with the Germans able to capture wide swaths of Eastern Europe, which gave it much greater access to raw materials than it had during the First World War. Then the invasion of Norway happened, then the invasion of France, and any plans for a North Sea blockade evaporated. Meanwhile, the home fleet would be parceled out for a variety of tasks and duties to try and react to what the Germans were doing. From reinforcing the defenses of Norway to convoy defense to trying to chase down German commerce raiders, all of them had to be done by the Royal Navy. In the end, the first 2 years of the Second World War would be nothing like the First World War, at least for the Royal Navy. Instead of an ironclad cordon held across the North Sea, they would instead be faced with what felt like enemies at all corners. The Germans and their commerce raiders, both U-boats and surface ships, were able to use the Norwegian and French ports to launch attacks from very different angles than they had before 1918. In the Mediterranean, they were faced with an Italian navy that was an enemy. At the very best, the Italian navy occupied a lot of Royal Navy ships, and at worst, they threatened to evict them from the Mediterranean altogether. And this was all before the entry of Japan into the war in late 1941. Overall, when evaluating the Royal Navy's preparations for war, it's really interesting to see kind of what they got wrong and what they got right in the years before the war. There were a lot of sort of tactical and small-scale things that they got really right, you know. They didn't expect to fight as this big grand fleet anymore. They were prepared to break off bits and pieces of the fleet to do various jobs, and that's exactly what they would need. They were building aircraft carriers more than anybody else in the world, and they would use them to really good effect in a lot of different ways, even if they would end up losing several of them. And they anticipated a lot of what the Germans and the Italians would do in terms of how they would use their ships and how they would try to capitalize on the strengths of those ships to interdict trade or to try and control the Mediterranean. But at a higher level, at like a grand strategic level, they weren't really able to predict just how catastrophically bad the first 2 years of the war would go for Britain. You know, they did not expect Norway to fall. They did not expect France to fall so quickly. The French fleet was always an important piece, an important friendly puzzle piece to use against their enemies, and it would be gone. And so I think in a lot of ways, not understanding how bad things could get on sort of a strategic level makes some of the other preparations of the Royal Navy before the war look like they were mistakes or look like they were not properly predicting how things were going to go. When in fact, they made a lot of the correct decisions. It's just the deck got stacked against them so heavily, so quickly, even from a geographic perspective by itself, that all those other good decisions kind of got outweighed by what was happening. Anyway, that's kind of a decision or a discussion for another day or future podcast episodes where we will actually be talking about some of those events in detail. But I think this has given a pretty good overview of what the Royal Navy was planning to do and how they plan to fight a future war. Now, next month on the Patreon feed, the episode will be a little different. I'm kind of breaking away from some of this pre-war discussion. I'm going to try something new where we're going to go into pretty good detail about some of the diplomatic communications that were happening during the May crisis in Czechoslovakia, which will be the topic of our next mainline episode. So we're going to try something slightly different here with the Patreon episodes, where instead of talking about something completely different, we're just going to go into more detail about something we're discussing on the mainline podcast episodes, which is probably a kind of a more sustainable way to do these episodes once we get into the war years, and hopefully you enjoy that. Again, thank you for listening, and thank you so much for your support.